within the opulent walls of a luxurious hotel in room 914. After the gala dinner concluded, the atmosphere was charged, the sounds of champagne flutes, laughter, and fragments of conversation filtered through the closed doors, hinting at secrets about to unravel. 2 hours earlier, the ballroom had emptied, its lively and relaxed guests departing, while faint music still echoed in the gold-adorned corridors. Security had dwindled, leaving only a single guard by the elevators. On one of the upper floors, just steps from the fateful room, a personal drama was unfolding. The protagonist, frantically searching for his phone, found himself in a situation he couldn't have foreseen. His companion had asked him to return to the room for a charger, promising to join him after a brief discussion about quarterly metrics. Upon his return to room 918, he was met by silence and darkness, which puzzled him. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by a muffled male voice, confident and unhurried, followed by laughter. It was his companion's laughter, but not as he knew it. This was a laugh full of life and emotion, cutting through layers of time and denial. What secrets lay behind the closed door of room 910? What truth was the protagonist about to discover? And how would it change his life? The answers to these questions awaited, promising a captivating and emotional journey. He didn't resort to insistent knocking, nor did he allow himself to burst in unceremoniously. He simply listened. Just 30 seconds. That was the limit he set for himself. 30 seconds to freeze by the door, feeling his heart pound wildly in his chest, his mouth go dry, knowing that something was happening in close proximity that would forever change their lives. Her voice, laced with flirtation and unabashed sensuality, seeped through the narrow gap beneath the door. There was such vitality in that voice, while he himself felt petrified. Then footsteps approached, growing faster and more hurried. Panic-stricken, he retreated, seeking cover in the corridor by the ice machine. The door swung open, and Haley stepped out. Her hair was disheveled, a phone in one hand, while the other adjusted her dress, as if she had just changed. She didn't immediately notice his presence. Only when he emerged from his hiding spot and spoke her name did her entire body shudder, as if confronted by a ghost. The phone slipped from her hand. "Ellis," I thought. "I thought you were still downstairs," she stammered, fumbling for words. He asked no questions. He simply watched her, and in that moment, she did something he hadn't expected. She reached out a hand to him, tears already glistening in her eyes, her lips silently mouthing words. It was as if she had suddenly remembered something important, something she desperately wanted. He leaned in, close enough for only her to hear his words. "Not after this." Her hand froze in mid-air. He didn't wait for excuses, didn't need explanations veiled by regret. He turned and headed down the stairs, leaving the hotel and freeing himself from a spell he had been under for too long. The author still wonders, did she remain in the corridor, weeping inconsolably, or did she return to the room, closing the door tightly behind her? All he knew was that no sound emanated from room 942 anymore, but a storm raged within his soul. He didn't go home. He didn't even consider it. Instead, he aimlessly wandered the luxurious hotel lobby, like a restless spirit, not knowing where his feet would lead him. The hall buzzed with an atmosphere of fun and carefree abandon. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and people, absorbed in their own importance, paid no mind to the man falling apart right before their eyes. And in this, strangely, he found some solace. He stopped at the bar and ordered a sparkling water with lime to blend in, staring at the exquisite marble floor, desperately trying to steady his trembling hands. People bustled past, nodding politely, offering perfunctory smiles. One of Haley's department colleagues, Mike, it seemed, clapped him on the back and said something like, "Great turnout today, huh?" The author merely nodded silently in response, unable to utter a word. Her voice, full of pain and despair, still echoed in his ears from the ill-fated corridor. He could still smell her perfume in the air, mixed with another's cologne, and the sensation caused an unbearable burning in his throat. He tried his best not to imagine what might have happened behind that door, but his mind, like one possessed, was already painting terrible pictures, filling in the blanks, adding dark shadows, creating a scene he shouldn't have witnessed. But he had heard enough to grasp the full horror of what had transpired. Settled in one of the ornate armchairs by the fireplace, clearly designed for impactful photographs rather than comfort, he tried to catch his breath. Unexpectedly, a woman with a Kelly Operations badge sat beside him, kicking off her high heels and complaining about the tiresome nature of such events. He nodded mechanically, feigning interest in the conversation. A casual mention was made of the open bar and certain romantic encounters in the back room. He forced a smile, though his mind was far from the present. His body continued to perform its usual actions, simulating presence, but his thoughts hovered high above the room, balancing between anger and a profound sense of humiliation. His gaze fell upon his wedding ring. Suddenly, it felt like a foreign object, a heavy burden, as if it didn't belong to him. His attempt to remove it was futile. His fingers were swollen, either from the stuffiness of the room or perhaps from the shock he had endured. The ring wouldn't budge. And then he saw her again. Haley had returned alone. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for him. Like a battlefield, when their eyes met, he expected to see confusion, an attempt to avoid him. But she approached him confidently, with the familiar expression she always wore when she wanted to hide the truth, calm and composed, as if she hadn't just shattered everything that bound them together. Ellis heard a soft voice calling his name. She approached him, but he remained still, fixing on her a gaze that seemed to hold nothing but emptiness. "Haven't we discussed everything already?" he said. Haley knelt beside his chair, trying to speak more quietly, as if they were merely a pair of guests at a social gathering, not two people teetering on the brink of an abyss. "It didn't happen the way you imagined," came the excuse, drawing a bitter, suppressed smile from Ellis. Leaning slightly closer to her, as if sharing a secret, he said, "Then explain to me, Haley, what truly happened." "Because from my perspective, you brought him into our shared bedroom." A barely noticeable tremor ran through her body. Not escaping his notice, she lowered her eyes, biting her lip. "I wasn't myself. I drank too much. You came up after me." "I came up after you?" He repeated her words, infusing them with a sarcasm he hadn't intended. "Did you accidentally take the elevator to our floor, to our room?" She remained silent in response, hugging herself as if trying to keep warm. There was no trace left of the woman who used to fall asleep on his chest, dreaming of the future. Now she seemed small and lost, perhaps remorseful, or perhaps just cornered. "Not here," she whispered, casting an anxious glance around. "Agreed," he replied, rising from his seat. It would be extremely awkward if anyone witnessed this scene. She reached for him again, her fingers barely brushing his wrist. That insignificant, yet once so meaningful gesture, which used to mean everything to him, now only elicited repulsion. He sharply pulled his hand away. "I've said it all, Haley," he said bitterly. "After everything that's happened, this is impossible!" And he resolutely walked past her, not towards the exit, but towards the elevator. Not back to the ill-fated room 914, where they had recently been happy, but simply somewhere far away, into the unknown. In that moment, he had no idea what he would do next. Where would he spend the night? How would he break this terrible news to his parents? What would he say to her sister, who had always admired their relationship, considering it perfect? But one thing he knew for sure: what they had shared was irrevocably lost, and it seemed this bitter truth had finally reached her consciousness too. He vanished into the elevator car, leaving her in that ballroom, which suddenly seemed too bright, too noisy, overflowing with people unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded there just minutes before. Unexpectedly, he found himself in room 910. Not because he was invited, but because the door was slightly ajar, and muffled music, cheerful laughter, and a fragment of a phrase. "He's probably not coming back," drifted out. It was a typical after-party, common after corporate events, young employees, ties loosened and shoes in hand, crowded around the minibar, pretending nothing of significance was happening. He walked in as if he belonged, took a soda from the table without asking permission, and settled into a dark corner, away from the light. No one questioned who he was. Everyone was too engrossed in discussing sales plans and an awkward karaoke episode. But he listened intently, hoping to hear her voice. He kept waiting for Haley to appear in the doorway, pretending everything was fine, laughing too loudly, trying to prove an unseen point, but she didn't appear. Not yet. Instead, he observed those around him, as if nothing had happened. He wanted to scream that the earth had opened up upstairs, that someone was destroying a marriage, whispering destructive words, but he remained silent. That was his usual reaction. That was who he had always been. 20 minutes later, he discreetly left the room and headed to the far end of the corridor, driven by a complex mix of emotions. Perhaps it was a form of self-torture, or an unconscious desire to confirm her absence. Room 914 loomed dark and silent. Stopping before the door, he froze, his hand hovering hesitantly over the handle. Though his keycard remained a useless artifact, there was no need to enter. Deep down, he already knew what had transpired within those walls. He felt it in every fiber of his being, detected the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. Her presence. His. He was about to turn and leave, when a sound reached his ears, freezing him in place. Laughter. A voice he would recognize out of 1,000. Not hers, his. Fletcher was in room 916, just 2 doors down. That voice was unmistakable, self-assured, arrogant, imbued with an effortless confidence he himself had never possessed. He was on the phone, loud enough for fragments of phrases to penetrate the thin walls. Not proud of his actions, he pressed his ear to the wall. Something inside demanded confirmation, some solid ground to cling to, beyond the painful echo reverberating in his chest. "She'll come around," Fletcher said. "She always does." A short pause followed. "No, he left, or I would have done the same." Guy looked pathetic. Another pause. "She's probably crying now, but give her a week, tops." He didn't remember the moment he left, as if a haze had enveloped his consciousness. He vaguely recalled reaching the stairwell, but distinctly felt himself clutching the banister, knuckles white with pain. A furious flame of shame and anger engulfed him, threatening to buckle his knees. He sank to the cold floor of the stair landing and stared at the emergency exit sign, as if hoping to find an answer there, a direction for his next steps. She'll come around. She always does. This wasn't just arrogant confidence, but an ingrained habit. What had happened wasn't a casual lapse. It was a natural progression of events. It was as if he had become part of a dance they had performed before, meaning he hadn't just encountered a fleeting weakness, but had intruded on a chapter already being written, one they planned to continue without him. Images of their home flashed through his mind, the framed photo in the hallway from their trip to Mendocino, the coffee mug with the endearing E and H initials, the plants he carefully watered every morning while she silently scrolled through her phone. All of it seemed ghostly, fake. Perhaps everything had long since faded, and he had been alone in trying to breathe life into dead feelings. His phone vibrated, displaying her name. He didn't answer, unable to find the strength. Soon, a message arrived. "Please come back. We need to talk." He stared at the screen until it went dark, and for the first time that night, tears welled in his eyes. Not loud, not theatrical, but quiet, bitter tears, because he couldn't understand what hurt more, her actions or her certainty that he would simply come back after everything that had transpired. It was deep into the night when he finally managed to tear himself away from the cursed staircase. His legs were numb, as if petrified. His shirt clung treacherously to his back, soaked with the sweat of long hours of emotional torment. The tie, still tightly knotted around his neck, that absurd symbol of who he was supposed to be that evening, now felt like a noose, tightening with every passing minute. With no idea where to go next, he still walked, avoiding a return to the glittering lobby of lies, and to room 914, the epicenter of his personal tragedy. Exiting through a service door, he passed two indifferent hotel staff members, engrossed in their smoke break, who didn't even glance at him, and found himself in the deserted parking lot. Finding a secluded spot between two concrete pillars, he sank to the cold floor, as if trying to melt into the night, to disappear from this world. At that moment, his phone vibrated again, shattering the silence. "Ellis, please, I need to explain everything. Just come up." After only a few agonizing minutes, the next message arrived. "I'm alone in the room, I swear. Please, just talk to me." And finally, the final blow. "It's not what you think." That phrase was the last straw, breaking something deep inside him. Because if he was sure of anything, it was that everything happened exactly as it appeared, and she knew it perfectly well. But she was still trying to veil the truth with a layer of lies, to make it seem as if he had misinterpreted her embrace with another man in their room, in their marriage, in everything that was left of his trampled dignity. He returned to the hotel room, not out of a sudden surge of belief in her words, but from a burning need to look into the very soul of the lie. He needed to assess the extent of the damage she was willing to inflict on their life together before admitting that only charred ruins remained of their home. Without a word, he paid with his card at the reception, explaining that he had accidentally locked himself out of his room. The receptionist, without looking up, handed him a duplicate key when he opened the door to 942. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, barefoot, her hair down. Her eyes were inflamed, either from tears or a carefully staged performance. He could no longer distinguish truth from lies. The stale scent of wine and irreparable error hung in the air. Seeing him, she abruptly jumped up. "Ellis, thank God you're here." He gestured to stop her. "No need. Just sit down." She hesitated but obeyed. A silence hung in the room, so thick it seemed tangible, a silence permeated with the realization that what had happened could not be undone. "I need honesty from you," he said. "You owe me at least that." She nodded, but her gaze betrayed the panic of a cornered child. "It's not as bad as you think." "Did he touch you?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Yes," she blurted out, then hastily added, "But was this the first time?" She fell silent, and that prolonged pause spoke louder than any confession. His breath hitched. He looked at her, as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps she was. Perhaps the woman he had once tied his life to had long since vanished, leaving behind only a soulless replica, mechanically repeating words she no longer believed herself. The woman's voice was filled with genuine regret. "I made a mistake. Everything got out of control. He was too aggressive, and I didn't know how to stop it. This evening was exacerbated by too much alcohol. My thoughts were muddled. He pursued me all the way to the room, but I absolutely didn't plan for this." The man couldn't suppress his sarcasm. "You brought him here, into this room, our private space, and you want me to believe your innocence and lack of malicious intent." She tried to justify herself. "It wasn't at all like you think." His voice took on an angry edge. "Then how was it, Haley?" The sounds from the corridor didn't resemble two strangers making a casual mistake. Rather, it sounded like a well-rehearsed dance. The woman burst into tears. The tears seemed genuine, as if a dam had broken, revealing true feelings. It seemed to him that such tears are born when the house of cards of lies begins to crumble, and the only recourse is a plea for forgiveness. "Please don't throw everything away because of this," she whispered, and those words struck a chord. He realized that was exactly what he was doing, discarding everything that bound them. Stepping back, he gave himself time to process her words. "I wasn't throwing anything away," he quietly replied. "For the past year, I've desperately tried to save our relationship, while you were building something parallel. I gave you freedom, forgave your mistakes, and was always there, even when you left me at parties, going off with other groups, other people, into another life, and you talk about throwing away." "You already lit the match, Haley. I'm just stepping aside so the flame doesn't consume me, too." She covered her mouth with her hand, as if about to scream, but the silence remained unbroken. He sharply turned to the door, grabbing his bag from the corner of the room. "I'll stay with my brother for a while," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "Your lawyer will be in touch, and when they do, please don't lie to them. Tell them the truth, what you told me, that it wasn't what it seemed at first glance." He left without waiting for her answer. There was no dramatic door slam, no parting words. He simply walked out, feeling, for the first time in years, a sense of liberation from something that had never truly belonged to him. The drive to his brother's house passed in almost complete silence, broken only by the monotonous hum of tires slicing through the wet asphalt. As he reached the highway, rain began to fall, and its sound, hitting the windshield, felt more like a lullaby for the dead part of his soul he hadn't yet buried. No tears fell, no scream escaped. He felt petrified, feeling nothing but exhaustion and emptiness. His gaze was fixed on the tail lights of the cars ahead, as if they could lead him somewhere free from this oppressive sense of defeat. Grant lived in a modest 2-story home, 35 minutes outside the city, with his wife and 2-year-old son. He was the kind of person who didn't need much to be happy: a cozy backyard, a fridge full of leftovers, and his favorite recliner, always smelling of popcorn and baby wipes. Grant opened the door, wearing a worn hoodie, his face sleepy and disoriented, a spoon in his hand as if he had been expecting an unexpected guest. "Ellis, it's almost 2 a.m. What happened, buddy? Are you okay?" Ellis shook his head, and with that simple movement, his lips trembled. "She cheated on me," he managed to choke out. Grant didn't ask any further questions. He simply pulled his brother inside, locked the door, and without a word, poured him a drink. The night enveloped him in anxiety. Sleep remained elusive, leaving him with only the sofa, an old blanket that still carried the scent of past intimacy, and the quiet crackle of the baby monitor from the nursery. His gaze was fixed on the ceiling, his mind vainly trying to recall their first embrace, not out of longing for what was lost, but from the emotional void that had settled in. Every memory of her was now poisoned by bitterness. Morning brought 9 unread messages from Haley, and 2 missed calls, all unanswered. They were immediately forwarded to a folder labeled Legal, and notifications were silenced, as if severing the last threads. Later, taking advantage of Grant's wife and child being at her mother's, he decided to have a frank conversation. Without holding anything back, he recounted the story of Fletcher, the hotel room, the web of lies, and the overheard phone call. Grant listened silently, with the reserved attention characteristic of older brothers. When the story was finished, he stood up, turned off the television, and uttered words that etched themselves into Ellis's memory. "You need to understand one thing. This wasn't a mistake, not an alcohol-induced accident. This was a conscious, repeated choice, and whatever part of you clings to hope for repair, you must eradicate it immediately." He nodded, but the full meaning of those words only truly sank in later. For deep down, in the most vulnerable part of him, the question continued to torment. Could he have acted differently? Had he loved enough, been generous with compliments, inventive in bed? Had he too easily allowed Fletcher to see and exploit the existing cracks? That memorable evening, the computer screen lit up with an incoming email bearing an intriguing subject line: "You don't have all the information." The sender was a certain Kira, no last name provided, and her message was a detailed paragraph that began with the words, "I'm not sure if you remember me. We crossed paths at last year's winter gala. I work with Haley. I didn't plan to interfere, but I can no longer stand by and stay silent, watching what's happening." Every word of that email was scrutinized with intense attention, like irrefutable evidence in a legal proceeding he had been unwillingly drawn into. Kira described in detail how the flirtation between Fletcher and Haley had begun even before she joined the company. She mentioned their joint absences from conferences, which had become the subject of widespread attention, and whispered gossip behind their backs. However, no one dared to openly express their displeasure, because, and this thought particularly deeply affected him. She always got away with everything. Leaning back in his chair, he allowed that phrase to sink into his consciousness like corrosive acid. Got away with it. Had he, with his silent consent and support, unwittingly enabled this? Had he spent years building her a runway so she could fly unimpeded into another's arms? His only reply to Kira was a short but sincere message. "Thank you for the truth. I wish I'd known sooner." And in those words there was a genuine bitterness of regret. Late that evening, as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the backyard, the author and his friend Grant engaged in an unhurried conversation, cool bottles of beer in hand. At one point, Grant inquired about the author's future plans. After a pause, the author uttered words that seemed to unfurl something deep within him. He realized the necessity of remembering his former self, the person he was before he met her. Perhaps in a desperate attempt to salvage the marriage and prove his worth, he had forgotten his own value, which existed long before his patience became an object of manipulation. However, the author foresaw that Haley wouldn't stop there. She would return, present her version of events, and attempt to write herself back into their shared history. The extent of her willingness to distort the truth remained a mystery to the author. The following 3 days passed in complete silence from the author's side. But Haley didn't give up, changing her tactics and the tone of her messages. From frantic desperation, she shifted to restraint, from pleading to measured composure. Suddenly, as if on cue, her words began to resemble a carefully rehearsed script, clean, controlled, and precise. She expressed a desire to meet and simply talk, aiming to understand the author's feelings, and stating her unwillingness to give up on their relationship. This last statement elicited a bitter laugh from the author. Give up? As if she still had a right to something she had already surrendered in that very hotel room, engulfed in the flames of betrayal. One Thursday, a phone call from his mother came, which in itself wasn't out of the ordinary. However, upon answering, Ellis immediately sensed something was off. His mother's voice carried a tension, a certain nervousness. For a full minute, she beat around the bush before finally saying, "I saw Haley at the market today." Ellis froze, asking, "What?" His mother continued, explaining that Haley had approached her and said she was trying to respect Ellis's space, but couldn't hide her concern. She mentioned that Ellis was staying with Grant, that she hadn't been able to reach him, and expressed her deepest regrets. Ellis remained silent, unable to utter a word. His mind frantically tried to decipher Haley's intentions. "She was crying, Ellis," his mother said, adding that Haley had claimed it was a monstrous mistake and that she needed a chance to explain everything. His mother replied that it wasn't her business, but Haley had looked utterly heartbroken. Ellis swallowed hard. He remembered that Haley hadn't shed a single tear when she opened the door of that ill-fated hotel. A long, heavy pause hung on the other end of the line. Then his mother whispered, "Is it true?" Ellis affirmed, "Yes." He heard the change in the sound of the wind on the other end. His mother gasped. She had always loved Haley, treated her like a second daughter, defended her. It seemed to Ellis that Haley had, in some perverse way, counted on this, skillfully leveraging the image she had cultivated for years. She had not only betrayed him, but also shattered the illusion she had so carefully maintained. Subsequently, it became clear that Miss Haley had not only corresponded with the author, but also reached out to Rowan, Mr. Grant's wife. In her message, she portrayed herself as a victim of circumstances, claiming she found herself in an awkward situation at the event, provoked by Mr. Fletcher's manipulations. She stated that the author had burst in amidst a tense conversation and jumped to hasty conclusions. Moreover, she asserted that she had attempted to put an end to the situation that very evening, expressing regret that things had gotten out of hand. Thus, she was not only rewriting the narrative for outsiders, but also implanting a distorted version of events into the minds of those close to the author. She meticulously reshaped the details, presenting herself as a bewildered, heartbroken, and even betrayed woman, as if the breakup were due to some trivial matter. However, the author was not surprised by such tactics, as Miss Haley had always been adept at skillfully shifting blame without raising her voice. She avoided direct lies, preferring to twist the truth until it was unrecognizable. The most terrifying aspect was that this method worked flawlessly. People listened to her words and nodded sympathetically. That same evening, the author decided to meet with her, not seeking closure, but out of a desire to see what role she intended to play this time. The meeting took place on neutral ground, a small public park by the river. It was early evening, and there were few people around. She wore a denim jacket over a dress he had never seen before, which for some reason bothered him. It seemed she had the energy to shop and choose a new outfit for this encounter, as if it were a date. She approached him as if they were still a unit, as if he were simply in a bad mood, and only a few right words could fix everything. A silence hung in the air, broken only by her soft, "Thanks for coming." He remained silent, observing her tired face. Her eyes betrayed sleepless nights, but behind that weariness lay something carefully calculated, as if the words for this meeting had been honed before a mirror countless times. "I know this looks bad," she began her prepared speech. "You showed up at the worst possible moment, when I wasn't myself. Alcohol played a role. I didn't mean to hurt you." Finally, he broke the silence. "Then why are you spreading a story that you were caught off guard, that he manipulated you, that I imagined it all?" A shadow crossed her face, a barely perceptible tremor. She blinked, as if trying to hide her confusion. "I didn't mean that," she quickly justified. "I was just trying to explain my side." "No," he cut her off. "You're trying to preserve the image of someone still loved, but that mask is gone." She took a step forward, as if trying to close the distance. "Ellis, please, we've been through some tough times." "No," he repeated, his voice firm. "We faced difficulties, but not betrayal, not what happened." At that moment, he noticed disappointment showing through her mask of gentleness. There was no remorse whatsoever. She changed tactics again. "Don't throw everything away for one mistake," she said, her voice sharper. "People go through worse. You're not even trying to understand." At that moment, the narrator couldn't help but laugh. But it wasn't a cheerful laugh. Rather, it was a nervous breakdown from the realization of the sheer absurdity and pain of the situation, a pain that was agonizingly familiar. Gaslighting, twisting reality, attempts to portray his reaction as the root of the problem, rather than her actions. He said with bitterness in his voice that he had spent years trying to preserve their relationship. He had made efforts when she stopped looking at him during dinner, When she started hiding her phone and avoiding intimacy in bed, he continued to fight, even when he felt like a stranger in his own home, because he believed in the value of their union. However, as he noted, he now saw the situation differently. She didn't shed a tear, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, as if paralyzed, her arms limply at her sides, while he turned and walked away, this time for good. She didn't follow him, and he didn't look back, because some stories aren't meant to continue, no matter how much one wants to believe otherwise. After that conversation in the park, an almost ominous silence descended upon his life. Not peace, but rather an oppressive stillness. It felt as if the world had paused, waiting for his next move. Haley didn't contact him for 2 days after he left. No messages, no calls, not even the usual passive-aggressive hints on social media. For a person who used to bombard him with messages if he was late from the grocery store, this silence was deafening. But he knew her too well to mistake it for capitulation. It was merely a tactic, the calm before the storm, and she wasn't about to disappoint. On the 3rd day, a physical letter arrived in his mailbox, addressed from her, titled, "Please read, this is important." That concise phrase instantly caused an unpleasant sensation in his stomach, as Haley rarely used email. For her, only what was spoken aloud or sent via text message truly existed. Therefore, even before opening the letter, it was clear this was her desperate attempt, a last chance to reframe what had happened, to present the situation in a light favorable to herself. His expectations were confirmed. It was not a confession of guilt, of course. Instead, it was a meticulously structured document, a kind of resume of their relationship. No emotions, just a semblance of order. Haley had formatted it like a project report, with sections, a description of events, her interpretation, Ellis's reaction, and, most cynically, possible options for moving forward. Under what happened, it stated, an inappropriate but brief encounter occurred between myself and a colleague, which Ellis misinterpreted in an emotionally charged environment. Under her perception, Haley wrote, I was under severe work stress and, unfortunately, allowed myself to cross boundaries with someone with whom professional distance should have been maintained. The Ellis's reaction section contained the phrase, Ellis unilaterally decided to leave our shared home and cease communication without fully discussing the incident. This opus concluded with next steps, a list of options, as if it were a corporate merger. As if one could simply vote on how this catastrophe would proceed, psychologist consultations, temporary separate living arrangements with a communication plan, mediation involving trusted family members. The man, having reread the message 3 times, couldn't decide what provoked more indignation or bewilderment. The text contained no hint of remorse, no sincere admission of guilt, not a single word about how she had crushed his heart and shattered his trust, or that she was unworthy of forgiveness. Instead, he was confronted with a meticulously crafted text, stylized as an official PDF document. It became clear that his wife was not striving to restore their relationship, but rather to create a favorable external impression, to minimize the consequences of her actions, as if it were a workplace crisis, an HR incident that needed to be localized and resolved before the quarterly report. And then it dawned on him, he hadn't married a woman, he'd married a PR campaign. Without dignifying her with a reply, he printed the letter and handed it to his lawyer, because if she had resorted to legal language, he would ensure that the next step was signing the divorce papers. At the end of the week, a call came from Brina, his wife's sister, who had always been more honest with him than Haley. Her voice sounded tired and agitated. Brina reported that Haley had told their mother about his nervous breakdown, that he had imagined everything, that he thought she was cheating on him, even though he had no proof. He couldn't suppress a bitter laugh, one that seemed to taste of blood and the events he had endured. Brina continued, "She's losing it, Ellis. She's not coping. She's making it all up. I just wanted you to know that I don't believe her." He sincerely thanked her, but in that same moment he realized the horrifying truth. Haley wasn't just rewriting history for her own justification. She was building a shield, creating a convenient narrative that she could present to anyone who inquired. For her, shame was always worse than guilt, and if she could convince enough people of his instability, dramatic tendencies, and overreaction, she wouldn't have to bear the burden of her actions. One day, a courier delivered a physical letter in an envelope to Grant's house. He immediately recognized the familiar handwriting. His heart pounded wildly. There was an almost irresistible urge to open the message at once. He stood frozen by the mailbox, torn by an internal conflict. For about 5 agonizing minutes, he wrestled with himself, weighing the pros and cons of burning the letter unread and forever erasing the past from his life. However, an insatiable curiosity, and perhaps a subconscious desire for closure to this painful story, prevailed. Inside were 2 sheets, covered in tiny handwriting, full of emotional outpouring. No greeting, no address, just a raw voice pouring onto paper, like a diary confession intended for other eyes. She wrote that her love deserved more than a fleeting one-night stand to judge its depth and sincerity. She accused him of giving up too easily and retreating at the first sign of trouble. She claimed Fletcher was merely a consequence, not the root cause of their breakup. And then came the phrase that delivered a devastating blow. "If you'd paid more attention to me, instead of feeling sorry for yourself, maybe I wouldn't have had to seek validation elsewhere." This was the last thing he wanted to hear. That phrase, like fire, burned away the fragile thread of forgiveness that still flickered in his soul, turning it into lifeless ash. For this was not merely an admission of guilt, it was a sophisticated weapon, a last desperate attempt to convince him that what had happened was not a betrayal. It was punishment, retribution for his perceived shortcomings. She wanted to make him believe that he, through his own behavior, had driven her to it. Slowly and carefully, he folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and without hesitation, threw it into the trash. That same night, Grant wrote his own letter, addressed not to her, but to himself. It wasn't eloquent or verbose. It was simply a firm promise he made to himself. "I will never again apologize for being broken by someone who was already broken." Turning off his phone and drawing the curtains tightly, he fell into a deep and peaceful sleep for the first time in weeks, like a man who had finally freed himself from the weight of the past and found long-awaited tranquility. The following weeks brought no miraculous epiphanies, no sudden enlightenment, no soaring music, and no song proclaimed, "It's all meant to be. There's a reason for everything." Only an unusual, unfamiliar silence descended, and at first, That was the hardest test. Waking up without checking his phone for a message, without listening for her footsteps, no longer feeling Haley's oppressive presence in every room, every item, every ritual he had shared with the woman he thought he knew. This silence forced him to confront everything he had previously ignored, and ultimately it paved the way for something entirely unexpected. For peace, not instantaneous, not all-encompassing, but palpable. The divorce process concluded surprisingly swiftly, and without complications. Perhaps even Haley, deep down, understood that she wouldn't be able to restore what was broken, despite all her tricks and manipulations. Once her attempts to rewrite the past crumbled under the weight of their own contradictions, she resigned herself. He saw her for the last time near the courthouse. She gave him a barely perceptible nod, as if they were strangers on a train platform. And perhaps they had always been just strangers. The turning point in the protagonist's life was not the breakup with his former beloved, but the rediscovery of a new version of himself. He returned to activities he had neglected for years. These weren't extreme feats, like conquering mountain peaks or skydiving, but simple, human joys. He began making himself full breakfasts again, instead of just settling for toast. He immersed himself in reading books, disconnecting from merely skimming headlines. Walks without his phone became an opportunity to enjoy the beauty of a sunset without needing to capture it. Jasper came into his life, a mixed-breed dog with hilariously crooked ears, lacking any sense of personal space, who now peacefully snores beside him, and that sound no longer brought on a feeling of loneliness. Last month, something unexpected happened. He met a woman named Marine. She wasn't strikingly beautiful or someone who commanded everyone's attention, but she knew how to see people, how to listen to them. When they first met, their conversation wasn't about work, past relationships, or old traumas, but about a lemon bar. Marine had bought the last dessert at the bakery he frequented on weekends, and he couldn't resist a sarcastic compliment about her excellent taste. In response, she offered to split the bar with him. They sat under a crooked umbrella, like children on a playground, enjoying the treat. He didn't tell her his story, and she didn't ask any unnecessary questions. Marine simply smiled a genuine, easy smile he hadn't seen in years. After a series of encounters, devoid of excessive seriousness and grand promises, a hope dawned for sincerity and lightness in relationships. It seemed that this new chapter of his life would be free from the burden of silence and oppressive suspicion, and love would no longer feel like constantly rescuing someone from drowning. The author came to realize that betrayal cannot define him, not if he doesn't allow it. He became convinced that people can resort to lies, distortion of facts, and manipulation. Yet truth, like a patient sentinel, always waits for its moment. And when a person is finally ready to abandon the survival strategy and begin living a full life, truth, like a familiar doorway he always knew existed but had forgotten how to find, reappears on the horizon. And so, months later, he is in a house, modest but his own, where no lies lurk beneath the floorboards, and no unanswered questions linger in the dark. The healing is ongoing, and the ability to trust, especially himself, is gradually being restored. But remembering that night on the ballroom floor, when she tried to pull him back into a story he no longer wished to read, the words he spoke resurface. Not after this. And he feels pride for that moment, Because that night, for the first time in a long time, he chose himself. And this time, he's not backing down.